Thank you, Dr. Sweats. It is a pleasure to be up here. If you are a student, just raise your hand. Let me see, let Dr. Selanikio see you. Great job. I appreciate you guys being here today. How many of you are pre-health? If you are pre-health professions in some way, he wanted to see that as well. A special welcome to any providers. Are there any healthcare providers in the audience? There's some in the back there. Great. Really a special welcome to members of our community. If you're from the greater Concho Valley, San Angelo, where are you? Are you out there somewhere? Great. So happy to have you guys here with us today. I have been told to be short, so this will be very short. This year we have Dr. Joel Selanikio. He embodies Dr. Roy Moon's vision. He is a practicing physician, but he's also a scholar, and he's also a global innovator. So we're really lucky to have him. He earned his BA at Haverford College, this is in Pennsylvania, in sociology, has a major in sociology and a minor in computer science. He worked on Wall Street, ran a company, did all kinds of things, and then found his way back to medicine, attended Brown University, and then Emory, is that right, in Atlanta for the pediatric residency. He is a global innovator in public health, and I can't say enough, and you can read all of the awards and all the recognitions, including the Lemelson Award. That's impressive at MIT for global innovation. So please help me welcome Dr. Joel Selanikio.
All right, we're going to switch over the slides, I think. We're going to switch over the slides, I think. All right, there we go. Thanks, by the way, for asking folks in the audience who were students, who were health-related, who were health practitioners. Can everybody who is in any one of those three groups raise your hand just one more time? Anybody who's related to health activities? Okay, so lots of folks. And mostly, I think, in the student phase, not yet in the practicing phase. So I spoke earlier today about technology in general, about information technology going all the way back to the printing press, computers, and now AI coming on board, and how it basically empowers all of us to do lots of different things. And because it empowers us relatively more than it empowers institutions, then that's significant in that we're sort of gaining capabilities faster than our institutions are. And in this lecture, I really want to talk a little bit more about how one of those institutions, and that is healthcare, an institution filled with experts, is already dealing with the advent of technology and the advent of new technologies like AI. If you attended earlier, I will apologize in advance that there's a little bit of overlap between the first talk and the second talk, kind of necessarily because the topics really overlap. I'll also say, as I said this morning, that my goal in giving the talk, the first goal is that you guys learn something that you think was important from the talk that you didn't know before. The second is that during the Q&A, and I hope folks will stay for the Q&A, I will stay as long as they'll keep the lights on in the room to answer questions and have discussions. I hope you guys can teach me a little something about what you're doing because every time I give this talk, every time I give talks like this, I should say, every time I have the Q&A, I always learn something that's relevant to the work that I do. The talk is in 3 different chapters. The first one, all about us, I'm going to talk about consumerization and its impact so far on health. In the second chapter, Attack of the Useful Robots, I'll talk about the advent of AI and again, the impact that it's had so far in health. And in chapter 3, the smartphone will see you now, I'll take an educated guess at what I think is going to happen over the course of the next decade. Let's dive in. So Apple's CEO, Tim Cook, made this comment a few years back about Apple's relatively new and relatively strong focus, what with the Apple Watch, et cetera, on health-related activities. It's kind of odd that the CEO of Apple would be making this statement since he's not a doctor and he's not a healthcare executive. He's a CEO of a consumer technology company. It's kind of like having the head of Sony or something make a statement like this. But given that Apple is the biggest company in the world, that has billions of dollars that they're spending on health, if they say they're going to go big in health, I think it's worth at least thinking about what Tim Cook is talking about. What does he think about? How does he think Apple could make a dent in health and the health problems that we have? And to understand why Tim Cook is in a reason, I'm going to show a slide I showed earlier, a slide that shows kind of an abbreviated history of digital information technology, of computers, over the course of the last 100 years. And we have to look at this history because it's important for us to understand the evolution of who was the user, who was the consumer, who was the person who was buying these devices over 100 years. At the start of digital technology, on the left, only institutions like universities, the government, the military, big businesses could use computers. In the 70s, things changed, the prices came down, things got smaller. You could actually sell these to individual small businesses, not generally to consumers, although that started to shift as well, not to individual people. But in the last 20 or 25 years, basically the world in which a lot of the students here just completely have existed, that is an era in which almost all the computing devices that are created on Earth are created for you, right? They're not created for a big company. They're not created for the US military. They're not created for a large educational institution. They're created for individual consumers to buy and use to their own benefit. And when you look at the spending on information technology, it's quite striking. It's not even close between what consumers spend on their information technology, like the phone in your pocket or probably more likely in your hand, and what everybody else spends on technology. And as you can see, healthcare is in last place. Right? Of all the major sectors, healthcare spends the very least on information technology. One way to think about this is, I know there's some people here who work in healthcare. If you work in healthcare, you undoubtedly use electronic health record systems. And they come from a few big companies, primarily these four, right? Especially Epic. Epic is the 800-pound gorilla of supplying computer technology to healthcare. However, it's important to understand that we spend more money on AirPods than all of healthcare spends on computers. Now, AirPods is kind of a quirky little product because everybody understands that iPhones is a big product, but AirPods is kind of like, how much money could Apple be possibly making on AirPods? Maybe $40 billion a year. More than healthcare spends on all of its computer systems. And why is this significant? That the vast majority of money in technology is on the consumer side and not in health. The reason that this matters for healthcare, the reason that this is significant, is because it is spending on IT that is the predominant method by which every person in this room has gotten new capabilities over the course of the last 20 years. Right? Most of the things that you can do now that you couldn't do 20 years ago are because your phone lets you do them, or your laptop lets you do them, and the internet lets you do them, right? And IT lets you do them, right? The contribution from IT to our ability to do stuff like make reservations and do everything else, check our health records and all the rest of that stuff, again, dwarfs all the other things that we do, right? I mean, higher education obviously is a big enhancer of our abilities. IT is probably more for a larger group of people. So the reason that this is important, that we're all gaining these capabilities, is because these big spending sectors like consumers, like all of us buying and using iPhones, are also generating more data, and data is what is powering this AI revolution that we hear about in the press every single day. You know, if you doubt that this is a significant difference between healthcare and consumer, consider this. In my kid's grade school, communication with parents and between teachers is done by WhatsApp. For most hospital systems, a substantial amount of communication is done by fax machine. No kidding, by fax machine. I can make an appointment online for a movie theater, for a restaurant, or for my barber, which is a small business that employs maybe 5 guys. But for most doctor's offices, you can't make an appointment online, right? What do you have to do? You have to call them during business hours, wait on hold, speak to a person, and then the person will look at a computerized scheduling system on their computer screen, and they will read it to you. right? That's how healthcare uses IT. The fact that Google will let me search all the news articles for the last 20 years in the space of the blink of an eye, but the hospital can't find my damn X-ray report, right, which happens all the time. These confirm this graph, and they tell us where the innovation money has been going for the last 20 years. And one of the capabilities that all this consumer IT innovation is giving us as consumers is the ability to diagnose and treat ourselves for things that were previously within the province of healthcare. Let me walk you through an example. So here we can see a simple graph that's showing cost on the y-axis and health-related capabilities for both the public and doctors on the x-axis. Now, doctors obviously have more health expertise than the general public, but they're also much more expensive than the general public, right? That's why the doctor is in that position. Now, let's imagine that it's 20 years ago, around this time of year, and you wake up and you got itchy eyes and a stuffy nose. This is how I've woken up in Washington, D.C., where I live, for about the last 3 weeks as we enter cherry blossom season. In order to get treated 20 years ago for what is almost entirely likely to be seasonal allergies, what would you do? Well, you would call a scheduler. You would make an appointment. You would show up at the appointed time at the front desk. You would then be taken by another person, usually a nurse, back to an exam room. You'd wait for the doctor. The doctor would come in. The doctor would talk to you, give you a piece of paper with a prescription on it. You'd take the piece of paper with the prescription, take it to a different location, give it to a pharmacist, wait for maybe an hour or maybe a day, and then the pharmacist would give you your allergy medication. You might even need to make an appointment to speak to a specialist. That is a lot of people and a lot of employment and a lot of money and a lot of time spent on seasonal allergies. But you know, something else was going on at around the same time 20 years ago. Within 5 years of the year 2000, all of these things happened. Right? From Google, the most significant information retrieval tool that humanity has yet devised, to, and of course for general information or for medical or health-related information, plus all these health-related things aimed not just at doctors, not just at nurses, right? Not just at practitioners, but at the general public as well, to give you information to understand about your health and what you might do for different conditions. These things just didn't exist before that. You could go to the library and check out a book. But all of a sudden, around the year 2000, you could go online in the blink of an eye, probably not on a smartphone, probably on a laptop or a desktop computer, and you could find this information out instantly. So what happened when both doctors and the general consumer at the same time got access to all these great new information tools? Well, we all got smarter, right? We all gained capabilities, including, suddenly, according to medical science and the FDA, the ability to diagnose and treat our own seasonal allergies, as Claritin was made over the counter. Right? Claritin used to require somebody like me, used to require the expertise of a doctor to decide that you might benefit from Claritin. And once they made Claritin over the counter, that little bit of healthcare that I've described on the top there, that little bit of employment, that little bit of healthcare revenue, just wasn't healthcare anymore. It was just something you picked up at the drugstore. And it wasn't just seasonal allergies. Over the last 20 years, many, many drugs have been made over the counter for many different conditions. So the reason that consumerization of tech matters for healthcare is that some of the things, like using OTC or over-the-counter medicines, some of these new consumer capabilities result in a hit to healthcare. They pull activities, they pull revenue out of healthcare. Things that we used to do in healthcare, we used to need healthcare for, we don't need it to do anymore. And, this is also significant, they simultaneously create a boost to the scale of health, right? Because the fact was, there are a lot of people with seasonal allergies before Claritin was made over the counter who didn't have the time to go to the doctor, or didn't have the insurance to go to the doctor, or couldn't fit into their schedule, or had a million other different reasons why they couldn't get to the doctor, and they just didn't get it. So, making it over the counter not only made it cheaper and made it easier, it meant there was an entirely new population of people that could benefit from it that before couldn't get it, and all of a sudden they could. And sure, when you think about it, it's better if you could see an expert allergist to discuss your seasonal allergies. But for most people, Dr. Google is good enough to say, Google, I'm sniffing and my eyes itch, what's wrong with me? And Google will give you the right answer almost all the time. Go to the drugstore and buy some Claritin. All right, so if you're a sharp audience and there's a guy up on the stage who's telling you that, forget about AI, over-the-counter drugs have already been affecting healthcare, have already been nibbling away at the margins of healthcare and reducing healthcare revenue, you need to see some evidence. So let's talk about what evidence there is. Regarding the boost of scale, there's no question that as drugs are made over the counter, people use more of them. And the use of over-the-counter drugs and the sales of over-the-counter drugs in the United States has soared in the last 20 years. What about the evidence for the hit to healthcare use and revenue? Exhibit A. There are currently more than 700 medications that are sold over the counter in the United States right now that used to require a visit to the doctor. And many of these are very commonly used medications, everything from Zantac to Flonase to Advil. Yes, Advil, right? Ibuprofen used to require the expertise of a physician with 10 plus years of schooling to give you for your headache. A Booz & Company report back in 2012, looking at the economic consequences of over-the-counter drugs, concluded that if we didn't have over-the-counter medicines, we would need almost 60,000 additional medical practitioners for all those appointments, for those patients who wanted to come in and get some Advil or get some Claritin or all those other over-the-counter medications. This is about 6% of practicing doctors in the United States. That is not a small number that we save by having over-the-counter medications. And note that birth control pills have just been made over-the-counter, one of the most frequently prescribed medications, and statins, right, for cholesterol, they're also sort of on the list, and I imagine within a year or two, statins will also be made over-the-counter. Now, I get asked pretty frequently, maybe once every couple months, someone asks me, hey, do you think that AI is going to replace doctors? But nobody has ever asked me if I think that over-the-counter medications are going to replace doctors, which is weird because that's what they're designed to do. The whole reason we have an over-the-counter program is to say we want to take these medications and we want to get rid of the doctor that is required to do it. That's what they're designed to do, and that's exactly what they've been doing. Exhibit B. This is a study that was published out of Harvard in 2020. They looked at insurance records for millions of primary care visits for insured adults. They wanted to look at insured because there didn't want to be a question about whether people could afford to go to see the primary care doctor or not. And they found, in looking at primary care visits from 2008 to 2016, an overall 24% decline in primary care. The researchers were able to ascribe about a quarter of the decrease to the use of alternative venues, as they call them, like going to urgent care instead of to your doctor, or going to the emergency department instead of to your doctor. But that still left about an 18%, right? An 18% decrease in visits to primary care. Amazingly to me, who's a primary care physician, when I talk to my primary care colleagues about this, no one has ever heard of this. They're like, well, we're pretty busy. And I have to explain to them that if primary care clinics were closing around the country and all the patients from those closed clinics were going to the remaining primary care clinics, it would feel pretty busy indeed as primary care slowly collapsed. And I don't know if that's actually happening. All I know is that the evidence is that primary care visits are precipitously dropping, and primary care appears to know nothing about it. Now, what's interesting is, if car sales were down 20% in the United States, you know that every car dealer in America would know about it. You know that the CEOs of GM and Ford and Toyota would know about it. And somehow, healthcare doesn't know about this. Also interesting, the authors didn't know what had caused the decline, but their speculation was that this was for younger and healthier adults who might be increasingly comfortable with online self-care or other digital tools. Exhibit C, and I think this is the most interesting one. We've heard our whole lives, if you've been paying attention to healthcare, about skyrocketing healthcare costs. And it is undoubtedly true that costs have been going up in healthcare for decades. This shows per capita costs since the 1960s, since the 60s. And as you can see, they've gone dramatically up from $249 per capita to over $7,000 spent per capita in healthcare in the United States now. But while this is a true graph, this is the true data, it's also true that while healthcare costs have been going up, the rate of increase each decade has been going down. What does that mean? That means that the skyrocket is still going up, but it is slowing down. It's not going up as fast. This is the first derivative of the first graph, right? It's basically saying what's the rate of change from the first graph. And the fact is, if you were looking to invest in a company, and the company said, hey, we've got revenues, look at that first chart, our revenues are great, they're going up. And then you said, I want to see how fast are you growing those revenues? And they showed you the second chart, you'd say, I'm not investing in that company. Something's obviously wrong. Like, you're making less of an increase in profit every year. What's going to happen over the course of time? Well, what's going to happen over the course of time at the current rate is that healthcare costs will soon cross that x-axis and begin to decline. What does this mean? It means the amount of money that people spend to the healthcare system will begin to decline some point in the next 10 to 20 years. Someone said to me at a meal earlier today, they're like, there's no way that you could predict that we have this problem of diminishing use of healthcare. And I would have agreed with them until I looked into this and found the data and made these graphs and realized, well, actually, you probably could have predicted 20 years ago that this was going to happen because the same trend was evident if you looked 20 years ago. Again, I talked to people in healthcare, from the practitioners to the CEOs. Nobody has heard anything about this. I talked to some national level economists that living in Washington I'm lucky enough to be connected with, and they were all like, oh yeah, we know all about that. I'm like, do you know that healthcare doesn't know about this? Like, well, we don't know why they don't know, because we know. Yeah, we definitely know that the rate of increase, we don't know why it's happening, but we definitely know that healthcare cost increases are slowing down. A big mystery. And when you ask people in healthcare to explain why this might be happening, after they explain to you that they've never heard that it's happening, they mention a bunch of things that are just too recent to explain this 60-year-old trend. And even more interesting, the one thing that is never mentioned, that no one has ever mentioned as a possible cause for why the cost of healthcare might be decreasing or slowing down, is IT. Why is this interesting? Because in our lifetimes, ladies and gentlemen, the overwhelmingly biggest cause for decreased cost of services has been IT. Think about the other services you use. The things that, think about, people in the younger people in the audience won't remember this, think about travel agents, right? We used to arrange travel by going to a shop and sitting with the person. Now you go on Orbitz or Expedia, right, or kayak.com. Right? The overwhelming way in which the cost of services has gone down. So why doesn't anybody think that IT, over the course of the last 30, 40, 50 years, could be decreasing the cost of services in healthcare? Well, probably because of that earlier graph I showed you that shows we don't spend any money on IT in healthcare. How could computers be helping us to lower costs in healthcare if we barely use computers in healthcare? Well, it could be working that it's not that healthcare is using computers, it's that all of you in the audience are using computers to avoid healthcare, to not go to those primary care visits, to use over-the-counter drugs, to go to the drugstore, to use Dr. Google. Remember that the cost of a taxi ride has not been going down for 20 years because taxi drivers or taxi companies are good at technology. It's been going down for 20 years because Uber and Lyft are really good at technology. And they are using that excellent use of technology to pull riders out of traditional taxi companies and pull them into something that isn't a taxi company, into Uber and Lyft. So the take home from this chapter is that tech and making things over the counter, deregulation, are empowering consumers to do more without healthcare. And you can already see the impact in the numbers if you look. And thirdly, that healthcare apparently has not really looked at this. Now, if this is already happening, what happens when we add AI, the latest IT revolution, into the mix? Sam Altman, I showed the same slide earlier today. Sam Altman is the CEO and co-founder of OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, also the CEO and co-founder of Y Combinator, a startup incubator, a very successful startup incubator out in Silicon Valley. Now, it's probably worth stopping a moment to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to what AI is. And here I used Merriam-Webster Dictionary, pretty old school, to help me out. AI is computer systems, or the capability of computer systems or algorithms to imitate intelligent human behavior. And so far, we have two different kinds of AI. I'm sure many people in the audience know about this. The first one, the older one, which dates back in practical terms to about 2010, 2011, is machine learning. And the second one, which is relatively new, like the ChatGPT style of generative AI. Machine learning is used to detect patterns of various sorts, whether of sounds or images, and that translates into machines that can understand what we're saying, because it can understand the patterns of our speech. And machines that can identify dog breeds or plant species from the photos on your phone, right? And on the medical side, that means machines that can tell you if the chest X-ray is normal or it's not. More recently, we've got generative AI, right? Less than 2 years since ChatGPT was released. And that's not only used to detect patterns, but to use those detected patterns and imitate them to create brand new content, brand new sounds, images, and text. For example, you could use ChatGPT to write a story. And I didn't put that up there, but I wrote, with the illustration in the style of Pixar. Or make a video. For example, a video nonsensically about a dog lecturing at Oxford in a tweed coat. You just tell it what to make, and it makes the video. Or on the medical side, and I already gave this example to some folks during our meal, I was asked recently, maybe a year ago, at one of the clinics where I work, to write something called a letter of medical necessity, something I have studiously avoided having to write in my past practice. This is an administrative thing for insurance companies that patients need to get written. Somebody else has always done it for me, but a patient buttonholed me in the hallway, asked me if I could write one. I said, I have literally never written one before in my whole life, but I will try, and I'll double check it with the other doctors to make sure it's good. I will get this done for you. I took the patient's, 3 lines of information about the patient, I typed it into ChatGPT and it said, will you please write a letter of medical necessity? I want you to have a bulleted list of the patient's diagnoses with the correct ICD-10 codes. 5 seconds later, I had it. I printed it out. I showed it to a colleague who does it all the time, and she said, that's the most beautiful letter of medical necessity I've ever seen in my whole career. And I transmitted it to the patient. Now, I hope that you won't be surprised to find that our all-important graph of IT consumerization is also the reason now that we have AI. You see, it turns out that all that consumer tech spending has created a virtuous cycle, a cycle whereby the more phones we sell, the more the price of components comes down. And the more phones we sell, the more developers create more apps, which makes the phones more useful, so people buy more phones, which brings the price of components down. And so on and so on and so on. Now, we need chips to make AI work, and that's been an important part of this process. This is true with laptops and all computers, but especially with smartphones because everybody's got a smartphone. But the most important part is the data. And as I pointed out in an earlier lecture today, when people ask me, well, how much data are we getting? How much data are we using for this AI? We're using all the information on the internet, but you have to recognize that the information that we will collect while I'm talking to you today, right? The information that on planet Earth people will upload and write down and type in, right? The pictures that they will take, the things that they will write, the websites they will visit, the medical stuff that they will upload into the internet, all of that recorded data that's happening as I talk to you this evening. That's more than all the recorded data that humanity generated from the beginning of humanity. up until the invention of the iPhone. More data is being generated while we're sitting in this room than was created in all of human history. That's how much data we are generating, mostly with our smartphones, and needless to say, mostly in the form of selfies. That's not completely an exaggeration. We're uploading 10 billion photos a day just from iPhones. That's 3 trillion photos a year, hundreds of billions of texts, hundreds of billions of emails. And it turns out that AI, which has been described as a black box because sometimes we're not quite sure how the algorithm is actually working and making its associations. We don't quite know how it works, but we know that the more data you put into it, the better it does. And what that means is that AI is getting better, faster, in the sectors that have the most data available to feed it. What sectors are those? Well, you know, because I showed you that graph before. The sectors that are spending the most money on technology are the sectors that have the most data recorded, and that's the consumer sectors. This stuff, right, again, we've had machine learning AI since about 2010, and it is incorporated into essentially everything you do on your phone and everything that you do on the internet, right? Every time I gave my mom an iPad because every time I gave my mom the iPad to do FaceTime, she would shift the iPad in her lap and I'd only see the bottom, like the top part of her head. It's okay because now the iPad that I gave her has AI built into the camera that always centers her face in the middle of the screen. No more problem. It doesn't matter what my mother does. Unless she turns the iPad completely around, I will see her face dead center on that screen. This is incorporated into everything that we do. Now, what about in healthcare? Well, slow start, not so great so far, but healthcare is starting to take the advances in AI that were entirely developed for consumer purposes. And they're starting to apply it to healthcare problems and healthcare data. And some of the results are very useful. Now, I've given you a couple examples already, but one way we can think about what's happening in AI in healthcare is to divide it into administrative stuff and medical stuff. And to me, medical stuff is all the things that they taught me about in medical school, right, when I was a medical student. And administrative is all the stuff they taught me when I started to work in the hospital about filling out forms, right? And for a variety of reasons in healthcare, the part that's most advanced in terms of technology in general and in terms of AI is the administrative part. And that's because admin in healthcare is actually a lot like admin in any other industry, so it's pretty similar to what's already been done. It's less highly regulated than the medical side, right, than the patient record side, and it's also more data rich. Hospitals collect more information about your billing than they do about your health, basically. So we've got a lot more data to play with. Now, one example of admin that should be exactly the same as every other industry is scheduling. And while for at least a decade, I've been able to book an appointment, as I mentioned earlier, with restaurants and movie theaters and barbers and everybody else, in healthcare systems, we just still mostly don't have it. But we're starting to make some progress. And Phreesia is one of these companies that you never hear about, but you've probably used already. Because when you have an appointment coming up and it sends you a text and says, can you confirm the appointment? That's probably Phreesia, something that is sold to healthcare companies so they can start to automate, start to use techniques like AI. Now, just asking you to confirm via SMS is probably not really an AI process, but they go beyond that because you don't want to just replace what the front desk used to do by calling you up and reminding you about the appointment. You want to actually improve it. So what Phreesia does, one of the things that this software does, is it uses AI to fill open schedule slots. Right? Previously, if somebody canceled an appointment, it would rely on a human taking the initiative to look at that canceled appointment, that open spot in the schedule, and then try to figure out who they can call to maybe see if they could put it in. Translation, it never happened. With Phreesia, the system automatically sees there's an open spot, let me see who's up next, let me send all of them a text saying there's a possibility we could see you sooner, are you interested, and ask people to respond, respond with a 1 if you're interested and a 2 if you're not, or something like that. Obviously, that means that we are going to fill more spots. That means we're going to have impressive gains in both the service, patient satisfaction, efficiency, and revenue. And this is just the beginning as healthcare starts to use the same kinds of software that other consumer-facing industries have been using for a couple decades. How about on the medical side? Well, this has been advancing, but much more slowly. And some of the advances are just not widely known. I was at a conference recently, and people were speculating as to when the FDA might approve an AI system that was fully autonomous, that didn't require a physician to be involved in it at all. And I said, they already did that back in 2018, and everyone was surprised. The system I'm talking about is this, IDXDR. This is a system for autonomous AI diagnosis of something called diabetic retinopathy. This is a disease of the retina, the back of the eye, that occurs in people with diabetes. Diabetics are supposed to have an eye exam by an ophthalmologist every year to see if they're developing this diabetic retinopathy. And most diabetics don't have that happen because we simply do not have enough ophthalmologists in the United States to give all, I'm going to guess here, I think it's 30 or 40 million diabetics an annual exam, right? It's not going to happen. It's not happening. What IDXDR does is it uses that image recognition that is operating on your phone to tell you where the puppy pictures are, and it looks at the retinal images, and it tells you whether you have diabetic retinopathy. Approved in 2018 by the FDA, the first machine that has been approved to make a medical diagnosis without a medical practitioner. Viz LVO from a company called Viz AI. This software automatically analyzes brain CTs in patients that are suspected of having a stroke to identify whether there's something called large vessel occlusion, a serious problem in patients who have stroke, LVO. The detection occurs in a couple seconds. This is about an hour faster than it usually happens if a human radiologist needs to read the x-ray, because you've got to find the radiologist, notify the radiologist, they have to read the thing. This happens in seconds rather than an hour. And if the LVO is detected, the radiologist and the treating physician are both notified by instant messaging. Now imagine if your loved one was the one with the possible stroke who is being evaluated. What's the value of the hour that you're going to save with this software? Now ChatGPT is not a medical system, right? This is a general purpose consumer-facing system, but it is a working product, and so people have started studying its potential use even in this early stage for medical purposes. And this study, this is from a couple years ago, sheds some light on how many things we're going to be able to use it for in healthcare. What they did here was they took summaries of clinical decision support algorithms. That means within the medical record, if the patient has this and the patient has that and the patient is this age, then do this thing or notify this person, right? This is a way to supposedly support the doctor by automatically doing some analysis of the data within that. So they took the decision support algorithms, they printed them out, and they gave them to a panel of expert doctors, and they gave it to ChatGPT. And they asked both of those groups, or ChatGPT plus the group of doctors, to make their recommendations for how they might improve the suggestions. And then they had an independent and blinded panel who didn't know which was ChatGPT and which was from doctors, evaluate the suggestions. As it turned out, almost half of the top-rated suggestions were from ChatGPT. ChatGPT is not a medical piece of software. ChatGPT is the same ChatGPT that's available to all of us for free on the internet. It's hard not to see, I mean, this is bizarre, right? But it's hard not to see how this astonishing software, how beneficial, how even revolutionary this might be in looking at patient data and figuring out better things to do with it. Now in tech, we talk about the S-curves of adoption, right? This is the pattern where you show the slow start to adopting some new technology and then more people use it and it shoots right up and then eventually everybody's using it, so the period of adoption slows down. And if we look for the S-curves of adoption in healthcare, as I've been saying, if we look at admin use in green, we can see that it's earlier, right? People started using admin stuff way earlier. And it's way more advanced than medical use in pink. I am sure that if the trend continues, in 10 years from now, every single healthcare system in the United States is going to be using administrative AI. And it will make us a lot happier, right? We'll have a lot more automated bookings and all the kind of stuff that we use for everything from DoorDash to everything else, right? All that stuff will finally come to healthcare. But at the same time, if the current trends continue, I doubt that 50% of US healthcare systems will be using any kind of medical AI in their care of patients. So is there any place where we are using medical AI, where we're more fully using medical AI, or should I say health-related AI? I'll give you a hint. Yeah, on the consumer side, we're using a lot of health-related AI. In fact, I would be surprised if every single person in this room doesn't have AI monitoring their health right now. Because if you have a smartphone, unless you explicitly turned it off, it is monitoring you, right? Fall detection on the iPhone. I got my mom in her 80s, I got my mom an iPhone for fall detection. So it will notify her, it'll notify me, and it'll notify 911 if she falls and she doesn't respond. Gait detection. Now the iPhone and the Android phones also analyze my mom's gait to see whether the steadiness of her walk at age 84 is decreasing over time, and will notify me if that happens. Loud noise detection, arrhythmia detection, sleep monitoring, hopefully not right now, but crash detection, that's another new thing. And amazingly, all these things are running in the background on your watch or your phone, and they weren't even additional costs. They just rolled it out to your operating system of your phone that you already paid for, and it didn't even cost you anything. So the take-home message here is that healthcare, like every industry, is going to reap the benefits of the consumerization of tech and the resulting AI. But the consumer side, including with regard to health activities, is going to remain far, far ahead of the healthcare system. Okay, home stretch. Now we've seen that up to now, even pre-AI computerized systems are slowly pulling healthcare activities out of healthcare, letting consumers take more care of themselves with less involvement from doctors and other practitioners. We've seen that most of the advancement in AI now is in the consumer side, even though it's slowly being applied, especially to admin in healthcare. But ready or not, that's all going to accelerate now. Scott Gottlieb is a smart guy, used to be the FDA commissioner. Scott Gottlieb thinks it's not a question of if, but when AI will step into the shoes of doctors. So what do the next 10 to 20 years of healthcare look like? 2 words, better and smaller. Let's talk about better first. So some of the most exciting, maybe even revolutionary technological innovations in healthcare today came into use widely during the pandemic. One of them I'll talk about. Of course, I'm talking about a little something that doctors like to call telemedicine, and what everybody else likes to call FaceTime, that we've been using since 2010 for everything else in our lives. And now we are supposed to be amazed because healthcare says, we're going to use FaceTime too. This is what passes for innovation in technology within the healthcare system, and I think is a great example of what the writer William Gibson was talking about when he said, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? The next 10 to 20 years is going to see healthcare institutions finally using the tools that all of us, that all of their employees, that all of their patients have been using personally for a decade or more. Like texting, so useful in our personal lives. There's so many obstacles against using texting or any kind of instant messaging in healthcare. I gave you one example with Frisia, so we're finally making some inroads. How about location services? If you work in healthcare, you know that an enormous amount of healthcare capacity is wasted because a patient was late for the appointment or the doctor was late for the appointment. This is particularly maddening because all the patients and all the doctors and all the admin staff are carrying devices with them that know where they are at all times. But the system doesn't know, right? The healthcare system doesn't know. Now imagine if we could actually use this like Uber uses it, right? Or Lyft uses it, or any of these other pieces of software use it. Imagine it's 3:45 in the afternoon, and Google Maps knows damn well that your patient is 60 minutes away, and there's no way that they are making that 4 p.m. appointment, right? Because Google Maps knows, they know where they are, they know what the traffic is, they know where the doctor is. That appointment is not going to happen. Healthcare doesn't know anything about that right now, but it's going to know. Because of companies like Frisia and others, it's going to know about that. How about online scheduling? I already mentioned that. How come we can't universally always book an appointment with the doctor from our phone in 20 seconds? Why do we need to have another person on the other end of an audio call read us what they're reading on the screen of their computer? That's going to change. How about AI? Well, first of all, remember all these things that I mentioned these are all AI, right? This is all routine machine learning. We've had it, 10, 12, 13 years, AI operating in the background of your phone and your laptop and the internet. But in the next 10 years, we're also going to be seeing a lot of, especially on the medical side, radiology applications. I talked to you about a couple of these. VizAI's got the algorithm for reading strokes. Nanox is another company that is basically they have software that will check every single chest CT using software to look for something called coronary artery calcification. This is usually a separate test that patients get to try and figure out what their heart disease risk is, how likely are they to have a heart attack, is calcium building up on the arteries of your heart. But basically, VizAI is able to figure that out from any chest CT that's done for any purpose. So they can just add this in software, and it costs an additional 1 or 2 pennies per CT to also check it for this other thing that we used to pay, no kidding, $1,000 for a chest CT to evaluate coronary artery calcification. Huge possibilities there. Cure AI is another company that's coming up with great solutions to look at the chest x-rays we already take to identify early lung cancer. You get a chest x-ray because you're coughing with fever, you think you have pneumonia. It turns out you don't have pneumonia, but it flags you for, guess what? Unfortunately, you have lung cancer, but it's at a very early stage, and thank goodness we found it because of this technology. Lots and lots of radiology stuff, but it's also, and this is important, it's starting to be not just software. What we are looking at is a fully autonomous dental surgery robot from a company called Perceptive. It is prepping a tooth to receive a crown. It's not yet approved by the FDA, but they are in human testing. And in testing on real people, they have demonstrated that they can prep a tooth, make a crown, and place the crown in 15 minutes. Without this, that process takes 2 different 1-hour-long visits on 2 separate days with the dentist. Now, this is pretty amazing. If you ever had a crown placed, that'd be pretty cool and convenient, probably cost-saving. But imagine if this was applied to another widely used surgery, like hip replacements. It's the same thing, right? It's conceptually the same thing. Now, what about my other prediction? All right, I know that these things are going to make healthcare better for everybody, more convenient, more like all the other stuff that we do. What about the smaller side? Well, you remember IDXDR that I showed you before? This is the machine that can diagnose diabetic retinopathy without an ophthalmologist or any doctor. Right now, the company that makes this sells it to primary care offices. The idea is that the primary care doc can avoid having to refer you to the specialist, and they can keep you as a patient in their office, and they can charge you for the less expensive machine rather than you having to go and pay for the specialist or your insurance company. But the thing is, that's a marketing decision. There's no technological reason why this can't just be right next to the blood pressure cuff in the drugstore. All you got to do is sit down and put your chin in the cup, and it takes a picture of your eyes, and it tells you if you have diabetic retinopathy or not. And in fact, we might not even need the blood pressure cuff in the drugstore anymore, because recent studies, this again talks about the benefit of AI, show that AI looking at retinal images can actually provide a better prediction of heart disease risk than blood pressure. In fact, it turns out that AI looking at your retina images can see all sorts of stuff that ophthalmologists, expert eye doctors, never knew was there. Like AI can tell what gender you are. AI can tell what your age is. AI can tell what your blood pressure is. AI can tell if you're diabetic from looking at those images. So again, why would we need a blood pressure cuff when we got something better that can also be deployed? And again, this was something that currently is healthcare. I think 10 years from now, we're going to look back and say, oh, yeah, that used to be healthcare before they made it free at the drugstore. Wobot is a chatbot that is designed to administer something called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. This is a very effective treatment for depression and some other psychiatric problems. Until recently, this could only be administered by a trained human therapist. But initial results seem to show that Wobot, which you access just by messaging on your phone, and you chat back and forth with this cute little robot, that CBT from a chatbot is as effective as CBT administered by a human therapist. And here's the kicker. Wobot can do literally millions of these CBT sessions simultaneously at almost zero cost per patient. And we're not really just talking about psychiatry here. This is what could happen to every encounter in healthcare where the only thing that's happening is information is being exchanged, a conversation is being had. Those are things that are ripe for automation, with possibly greater patient satisfaction, because astonishingly, or maybe not astonishingly, I'm not sure, this is an article in JAMA from last year. They looked at patient responses to clinician, doctor-generated messages and AI-generated messages, and they found that across a wide range of specialties, satisfaction estimates were higher with AI responses than with clinician responses. Again, on the one hand, it's astonishing. On the other hand, it is routine for us to have unsatisfactory experiences with the healthcare system, so perhaps it's not so astonishing. What we're talking about, people here, as this becomes digital rather than analog, people talking to each other, is something in the domain of healthcare, but with the economics of Gmail. Because as things digitize, their cost tends to go to zero. And there's myriad examples, of course, that all of us have experienced, from music to everything else. One last example. This was published 2 years ago. Apparently, as you develop type 2 diabetes, the changes in your body chemistry affect your voice. Who knew? In ways that are imperceptible to your doctor, but they are perceptible to your smartphone. And in ways that are of comparable accuracy and a tiny fraction of the cost of traditional diabetes lab diagnostic tests. And one can easily imagine that if this is the case, and they demonstrate that this is as effective as other diabetes testing in a lab, that this is just rolled out as another update to your phone, like gait detection or fall detection. It also raises the possibility, and this would be astonishing for all the diabetics in this country, that we might not be able to just test the binary of diabetes or no diabetes by these chemical changes, that we might actually be able to detect your blood sugar level by changes in your voice, or by something else that the machine can observe and understand that we can't observe and understand. It's fascinating because a lot of companies, including Apple and Google, have been trying for about maybe almost 10 years now to come up with a way to detect blood glucose levels without a pinprick, right, without having to draw blood or do a finger stick. And the way they've chosen to look at this was the same way that they can detect blood oxygen. If you've ever had a pulse ox done of you at the hospital, this is where they wrap a little bandage around your finger. It's got a red light glowing in it. It sends light into your finger, and the light bounces back and is detected by the sensor. The more oxygen in your blood, or if your blood is highly oxygenated, it can tell by the reflection of light, by the color of your blood, how much oxygen is in it. And so you have this instant, amazing test to tell you what your blood oxygen level is, just by the color of your blood, depending on the chemical composition of your blood. And they thought we should be able to do this with blood glucose. They haven't been able to do it yet. It turns out they might not need to do it because it turns out there's another weird way that your phone can detect diabetes just by the sound of your voice. Imagine if this, which is currently healthcare, became free. Oh, this is the last example. It's my favorite example. ResApp is an app that was created by Australian research physicians and has been approved by European regulators, but not yet by the FDA. And this app listens to your cough. If you're a patient with cough and fever, listens to your cough and tells you if you have pneumonia or not. It can actually even tell you if you have specifically COVID pneumonia or not. And they were just acquired by Pfizer for $100 million or something like that. Pfizer, who makes Advil, Pfizer, who has, as the police would say, both the motive and the opportunity to increase direct-to-consumer sales of antibiotics for pneumonia, cutting out the healthcare middleman. And so will this eventually also be built into our smartphone? Will this also be something that we say, yeah, it used to be when you had a fever and cough, you went to the doctor. I know, it's weird. Now we just use our phone. Now, a lot of the discussion in medicine about AI has been in the context of using machine learning to read radiology images, chest x-rays, CTs, etc. The idea was whether machines reading x-rays would replace radiologists, the doctors who specialize in reading images. And as shown in this illustration, where previously you had a primary care doc who orders an x-ray, it's read by a radiologist who tells the primary care doc what the reading is. Pneumonia, no pneumonia, or whatever else they're looking for. And the idea was, well, maybe that radiologist will get replaced. And I can tell you as a primary care doc, I have friends who are radiologists, but I don't really care who's reading the x-ray as long as I get the x-ray read. So I don't care if it's a machine or my smartphone or the radiologist, I just want the x-ray read and I want it read as fast as possible. But ResApp raises the question as to whether that patient with the cough and the fever is actually ever going to get to see me, the primary care doctor, at all. And that interests me a lot. I'm not so interested in whether the radiologist is going to get replaced, but now we're talking about me getting replaced. And if the app says there's no pneumonia, I guess the patient, that's probably what it's going to say most of the time, because most of the time when patients are worried about having pneumonia, they don't have it. And if that happens, the consumer is going to save a trip to the doctor, and healthcare is going to lose that visit and that revenue. But if it's positive, they can go to the doctor. Or maybe the app might just prescribe the antibiotic. FDA's been looking at this seriously since 2019 at least. And exactly that was just proposed in the bill just a month ago or so, in a bill in Congress. Autonomous prescribing of medications by AI. As you can imagine, this is not well received by the physician community. So what happens when our already Google-equipped consumers and doctors get a hold of AI like what I've talked about? Well, we all get smarter, right? But this is more true for us as consumers than it is for doctors, because doctors already had the expertise to diagnose pneumonia. And obviously, this is not going to just work for pneumonia. It's going to work for lots and lots of other things, as I've kind of touched on with a few examples. Professional expertise is going to get increasingly automated in various ways, some of which make perfect sense and some of which are going to be surprising to us, like the diabetes measurement by the changes in your voice. But this will leave a diminishing set of interactions that will actually require a human physician or a human provider to provide. So, in the first chapter, we learned that the overwhelming majority of the money and the innovation in IT happens on the consumer side. And we also learned that the really powerful tools that we've all gained over the course of the last decades have already been pulling activities out of healthcare. But this has gone largely unnoticed. In Chapter 2, we recognize that AI, so far, is just like other kinds of information technology. It's developed on the consumer side and then slowly percolates into the healthcare space. So healthcare eventually gets the benefit and gets the use of these technologies, but the consumer side is always ahead. And in the last chapter, we learned that even many of the tools that are currently within healthcare, the AI tools that are currently being used in healthcare, will probably eventually shift to the consumer setting. And that as these tools digitize, they will adopt digital business models like Gmail. They will get free. So what do doctors have to do? What do providers have to do? What do people in healthcare have to do? I don't know, but I think a good idea would be we need to recognize that healthcare encounters that just involve information exchange are the most likely to be automated. We have to understand that surgery, procedures, activities that require cumbersome equipment or expensive equipment are probably the least likely to get automated, because it's going to be a while before they can get an MRI machine into my iPhone. We have to understand that the biggest companies in the world, with billions of dollars to spend without even noticing it, are working to make this happen. In part, to make healthcare better, but mostly to make healthcare smaller. We have to start thinking about new models of care that are actually based on the things that our patients have with them all the time, like their phones. I mean, you have smartphones that detect things like, that do EKGs, and most doctors I know, they don't want to see it. They don't have the time, it doesn't fit into their workflow, they can't make that happen. They're like, oh, that's great, I'm glad everything's great. Like, they don't want to see all this useful data that's being generated, by and large. I think we need to identify other health-related services that healthcare doesn't do that we might do in healthcare in order to maintain revenue. I think healthcare needs to identify who their competitors are, including Apple and Google. And they need to stop mocking Dr. Google. This is a thing in medicine. Doctors love to make fun of Dr. Google. And you guys going online to check your health stuff, just like we do, just like everybody else does, right? Dr. Google isn't perfect. Dr. Google is probably not as good as a doctor, but we need to recognize that this is where patients are turning. And most importantly, I think people in healthcare need to be aware. As I pointed out to you, how could you possibly have primary care visits decrease by 20% and nobody even knows it's happening? The CEO doesn't know it's happening. How is that even possible? I gave an example to someone. We were talking about Ozempic, the weight loss drug, and how snack food companies are working on plans for how they're going to deal with people snacking less. Well, this is going to affect healthcare too, right? Obesity is going to go down. The rate of diabetes is going to go down. What's going to happen to the hospital when cardiology visits decrease by 20%? Healthcare is not even thinking about it, not even working on it. So we need to be aware. Now, this has been a longer lecture than I anticipated. I tend to talk a lot. I appreciate your attention over the time. I'm happy to respond to questions. From the physicians, I'm happy to listen to gently worded criticism. Thank you so much.